And to give you some idea, just to get an idea where I'm coming from, I take a very fundamentalist approach. So I think that not only is Jesus a physical existing person, but that that he's the person as described in the Gospels, basically, right? In other words, to use like the Saint Nicholas example, right? I don't believe it in the sense of like, well, yeah, Saint Nick was a real person, but he's absolutely nothing like Santa Claus. I would actually take the position that Jesus is who he claimed to be, and pretty traditional understanding of how we got the information we got as well, which actually I think makes conversations between myself and mythicists, or just people with my position in mythicists, quite fun, because we can both take the claim of being fringe, which is nice, right? But at any rate, what do you think is the earliest source, really quickly, for Jesus that we have today?
I think really the only independent source that we have that we can really rely on is Paul. But even with Paul, I think that there are a multitude of problems if you want to argue that he existed in history.
For sure. And so then you would place Paul, I would assume, them right ahead of any Gospels and any sort of hypothetical Gospels as well, right? Like a Q document.
So I take the mainstream scholarship route when it comes to dating the Gospels and dating Paul, as well as which of Paul's epistles are authentically Paul, as authentic as we can determine. So I follow the mainstream scholarship when it comes to those types of things.
Absolutely. So then, just to clarify, does that mean you would accept the existence of Q?
No, I don't. I know that's kind of mainstream, but I actually agree with Mark Goodacre that the Q document or the Q gospel is indistinguishable from Mark, and considering that Mark was the first gospel written, all the other gospels copied off of him, it kind of seems like unless you can separate Q from Mark, I don't think that there's a good reason to speculate that a Q exists.
And for the record, I do actually tend to agree with most of that, in that I don't think Q is real, but I don't necessarily think it's Mark. But I'm just trying to, obviously flesh out the position. And so to recap for the audience, to make sure I'm understanding correctly, so you would take the minimalist Jesus position for the most part, with obviously, your own thoughts and some additions from other scholars, which is popularized by Carrier. You'd say our earliest source that we have is Paul, and that he would predate any known Gospels, as well as any unknown Gospels, most of which would probably be indistinguishable from known Gospels anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So, and that's I appreciate you fleshing that out for me. So the first thing I would want to approach with this, because I take the position that the Bible in and of itself, the New Testament in and of itself, taken from a strictly historical perspective, meaning that if I, were to take my fundamentalist cap off and just wear a historical cap, that the New Testament itself, in my opinion, is enough evidence to prove bare minimum that contemporaries of Jesus believed in an existing physical Jesus. And I have a couple reasons for believing that. So first off, I would take a position of early dating of the Gospels, which I'm sure will probably be something that we'll have to talk about, obviously. My view is that Matthew probably wrote first, and probably within a decade of the crucifixion of Jesus, followed either by Mark or Luke. I don't think the historical record is quite clear as to which one came first. I'm tempted to say Luke is third, because Luke is the most blatant with admitting he has other sources. However, Mark does appear, if you look at traditional sources, to be pretty late in the record, writing from Rome after Peter's in Rome, and also Clement of Alexandria just outright says he's after Luke. So that, I'm not really sure where to place those there. And then John being the last one, and I would personally take the position that they're all actually written before the year 65. I would then attribute what you would call the traditional authors to what our epistles. So Paul, Peter, Jude, obviously John, of course. And then from there, my basic argument is we have 8 independent sources because 8 separate authors. That would be our minimum, right? Obviously, if my position is wrong, we have more authors than 8 potentially. Using 27 separate works, all of which seem to very strongly suggest, if not outright declare, the existence of a physical Jesus. So we'll obviously get into the nitty gritty of that, but right off the gate, what is your thoughts with some of that?
Well, obviously, I disagree with all of it.
Right.
I think that the evidence for dating Mark to 70, or well, at least after 70, between 70 and 80, I think is strong. I think it makes sense. I think in order to argue that Mark dates prior to that, like way prior to that, like you're suggesting, I think that you have to speculate and assume a lot of things that you shouldn't necessarily speculate or assume. I think that the fact that all the the Gospels themselves being interdependent, on each other, I don't see how you can think that they're all independent if they use each other in order to generate their narratives. Even if you date them early, I don't understand why you think that they're independent when, regardless of which one came first, we definitely know that Mark, Matthew, and Luke all share common phrases and sense verbatim at times. And this is well established in the scholarship. And then John, we know clearly at least used the other gospels in order to generate his narrative, because like with the Lazarus situation, the 2 Lazaruses between the synoptic, I believe Luke is the one that has the one Lazarus, but John is very obviously reifying that Lazarus into history, and then is using that as a rebuttal to what Luke is saying in his gospel, which is that's part of mainstream scholarship as well. So I think that even if you suppose that they were all written early, I don't think that you can consider any of them to be independent, just because of those points.
Absolutely. So there's a couple things that I think, and that it's great. That I think that absolutely opens us up for good conversation. So let's just jump right into it, right? So a couple things I think that are important to note there, from my perspective, right? So the first thing is, I do think that in order to, I don't think we should have to establish complete independence in order to say a source is independent in a way. And what I mean by that is, so for example, Luke definitely uses the previous gospels. He says as much, right? In the beginning, saying that he went around asking the people and all that kind of stuff. The idea that he wasn't the first gospel and yet he didn't read the first gospel is almost preposterous if you think about it, right? Considering his own admission. However, that doesn't mean that he's not necessarily a independent source, because he's also getting, presumably, information from Paul, who he claims to know, information from other Christian believers around. Potentially he has 2 different gospels to look at, right? In other words, he might have some influence, absolutely, from Matthew or even Matthew and Mark, but he's also going to have witnesses clearly from everywhere else as well. Because like the idea that just like it would be preposterous to say he actually was asking people and didn't have any knowledge of these gospels, I think it would be equally preposterous to say he was only relying on these gospels and nothing else, right?
Okay, can you, if I can interrupt?
Absolutely.
Can you provide me where in Luke he cites his sources?
Well, unfortunately, pretty commonly throughout history, a lot of people will not cite sources specifically. So a lot of times, I don't think I could say
that's not true at all.
Well, of course it is. Of course it is. There's a lot of instances where we don't have like the specific sightings of source. In fact, one of the biggest criticisms against, like, for example, Eusebius, Herodotus, Josephus, is exactly that, that they don't necessarily always have, or their over-reliance on single sources will also come up a lot of times, right?
But I mean, they still cite their sources. See, Luke never cites any source whatsoever other than Scripture.
Well, one thing, so we can see some certain sources that, while not cited directly, as if, in other words, he's not saying like, I got this from so-and-so. He does obviously make a connection between the Luke character, which tradition would say is himself, and the Paul character. Now, obviously, that's going to get into another question that we're obviously going to have to talk about, which is the reliability of church historians in that time, right? But that obviously would give us at least one source there being Paul. Right. Presumably, I think that's safe to assume that one of his sources would probably be Paul in that instance. We can also presume, because we know he's not the first gospel, right? That's universally accepted by everybody from the beginning of time all the way up to now. I don't think anybody's ever claimed Luke was first. I might be wrong about that, but I don't think anybody has. So we can also presume pretty clearly he'd have at least one of those previous gospels. So while we can't get named sources, I'll grant you, I think it's pretty easy to deduce at least some of the sources based off of what we can prove through history.
Right. Well, no, actually, you can. Okay. So one, you can presume things, but unless he specifically says something, that's not citing a source, and so that all you're doing is speculating. While there's the simple fact that verbatim things appear in Luke that both appear in Mark and Matthew. So. He definitely had both Mark and Matthew's gospel, and he definitely copied directly from them. Now, if this Luke was an eyewitness or had some kind of personal knowledge of the events that happened, why would he need to copy verbatim and basically plagiarize these other two gospels?
Well, there's a couple things there. The first thing is that I don't think that Luke was an eyewitness. The tradition around Luke, and I mean Luke himself, like Luke the evangelist, is that he is actually he would be the personal physician of Paul for some time, and also he had some relation to Peter, it seems. Though I don't know if I know that they get Luke being the personal physician actually from Scripture. I don't know if the church fathers got his relation to Peter from Scripture. But nonetheless, Luke himself would not be a specific eyewitness, right? So that would be the first thing to say. The second thing, though, is at least partially, you do agree with me that we can presume some of Luke's sources, right? You agree for different reasons, but you do agree that, like, for example, we can presume one of his sources is probably Matthew, right?
Well, yes, but for a very specific empirical reason, and that's because there are passages in Matthew that appear in Luke at times verbatim, via the Greek. The Greek is verbatim in both works. So that's hard empirical evidence that he definitely used Matthew in order to generate his narrative. But
right. And so
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just saying, so we can, deduce some of these sources. For example, Matthew, I think it's probably safe to deduce that Paul would be one of his, and in one of two ways, right? Either he's an eyewitness like I believe, in which case the narrative is true and he knew Paul, or he's some other person like you believe, in which case he's very obviously influenced by Paul. Right. That's typically the argument that people give as far as Luke is concerned, is that he's influenced by the Pauline epistles. And I don't even necessarily disagree with that. Right. But regardless, we do have at least two sources that we know he's collecting, and we know that he has, and that's something that we can deduce pretty empirically. Right. And we know that he is making the claim that he's speaking to other sources as well while he's writing to this character Theophilus.
No, I mean, we don't know that. I mean, we don't know what sources he consulted as told by Luke, or the author of Luke rather, himself. Like we've been able to deduce using textual analysis and comparing Luke's gospel to other gospels that existed at the time, and we've been able to draw hard empirical lines between them. But if we're just looking at Luke and what he is reporting to us, we can't speculate any farther than what we can empirically show. And because, hold on. because like Mark's gospel heavily uses Paul's theology, we definitely know that in one fashion or another, either directly or indirectly, Luke was using Paul in order to generate his narrative. And so these are all reasonable inferences to make. But what I want to stress here is that it's not because Luke directly cites them. We've had to do extra legwork. And the reason why this matters is that Luke's gospel is not an not autobiography, but it's not a biography. It's not trying to tell us anything about history. It's trying to tell us about theology. In fact, Luke says that in the very introduction, the very beginning of his introduction, that in Luke. So, I mean, considering all of that, Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and Acts are not biographical. In fact, they differ so widely from actual biographies that were being written at the time that it's astonishing to me that anybody would consider it to be biographical.
So I do have a couple things to note, though. So it is important, I think, for us to note, you do actually agree with my overall claim, which is that Luke does have at least two independent sources we can verify, namely the Gospels and Paul.
No, I didn't say independent. So Paul would be an independent source. It's in fact, in my view, the only independent source, but the other two Gospels are not independent sources.
So you would make the claim then that both of those Gospels in some way derive from Paul. Is that basically where I would get that from? Like, is that how I'm understanding you correctly?
Well, no. So basically, Mark used Paul's theology in order to generate his gospel. But Mark also, and this is something that he explicitly says in Mark, he also used the scriptures, just like Paul did, in order to inform his gospel. And then Matthew used Mark in order to generate his. Matthew uses a redaction of Mark to expand upon it and tell their own that community's own message about Jesus. But it was definitely a gospel meant to usurp Mark. But Mark definitely used, Matthew definitely used Mark. And so I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, so it does, but I think it creates a little bit of a problem because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the narrative, for the most part, through mainstream scholars, is that we have evolving Christology through the Gospels. In fact, that's one of the reasons they would place, I think mistakenly, but I think they place Mark in priority over both Matthew and Luke, is because they say that Mark has this really low, almost adoptionist Christology. But it's very clear, even from Richard Carrier's own writings, right, which would be someone who's like on the exact opposite of where I'm at, right, that Paul has a very, very high Christology, like to the point of referencing the Father and the Son as, basically every time together with each other, like almost as if they're equals, right?
Does Paul say they're equal?
I don't think he specifically uses the word equal, but he does. He puts them together as if they were like saying, grace be unto you in the name of our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, right? As if they were equal partners.
No, but okay. I'm wondering, can you explain to me what Paul's theology is on the family of God?
Do you mean like the Godhead, as far as like the Father, Son, Holy Ghost?
Well, no. The concept of the family of God. See, in Paul's writings, he's got this concept of Jesus being the firstborn of many brethren. And in fact, anybody that's baptized as a Christian becomes a part of the family of God and is therefore a sibling of Jesus. So he very distinctly makes sure that you know that Jesus is the Son of God. I can't recall any verse specifically where he equates God and Jesus. He does call Jesus Lord, but I think that's that's a stone's throw from saying that they're equal.
Well, I think there's a couple things that are being missed, if I may. The first thing is, when he calls Jesus Lord, we do have to understand that Kyrios is a title that they were speaking about Yehovah with, right? Like, so for example, if you look at the Septuagint translation of, I think it'd be Malachi 3:1, but the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare you the way of the Lord, right? In the Hebrew, that's prepare you the way of Yehovah. And in the Septuagint, it's prepare you the way of, they would say, Kyrios, or Ha-Kyrios, I think it is. I think Ha is or maybe it's Ho. I don't know. I'm not an expert on Greek by any stretch of the analogy or any stretch of the imagination, right? But nonetheless, the point is that it's very well established that when he's using the word Kyrios, considering the fact that they're using Septuagint translations, which is universally agreed upon that the disciples were probably reading what we now consider to be the Septuagint translation. That's a claim not only of his deity, but of associating him with Yehovah of the Bible. And then couple that with him praying and in the name of God the Father and Jesus, as if they are equal partners in this, right? I think it's very clear that Paul has an incredibly high Christology, one where he would even consider Jesus to be outright divine. The same God as the God of the Bible. I don't know necessarily if he had a fleshed out view of like the Trinity per se, but I do think he thought that Jesus was fully divine for certain.
Oh, well, obviously Jesus was divine. I think that Jesus was purely only ever divine to Paul, but that doesn't mean that Jesus is God or that he equates Jesus with God. In fact, he makes sure to separate both of those entities. You see, in Jewish theology, there's a multitude of different divine beings, like celestial divine beings, and Jesus is one of those divine beings, just like Satan was one of those divine beings at one time. And so, like in the Old Testament, maybe you'll agree with me on this. I think that maybe this might be a point of agreement we can come to. Jesus is mentioned, the Messiah rather, or this figure that's supposed to restore the remnant of the Jewish people, is definitely mentioned in the Old Testament, wherever it talks about the word of the Lord coming to speak to people on earth and everything like that's Jesus. And it happens multiple times throughout the Old Testament. Anytime you see the word of the Lord came to Isaiah or Ezekiel or anything like that, that's Jesus walking up and having a conversation with them.
Absolutely.
Right. And so considering all of that, just because Jesus is divine doesn't mean that he is the God figure. That it doesn't mean that like Paul is associating the God figure. But let me transition a little bit to a somewhat tangential topic. And if Matthew was written first, and then Mark was written after Matthew, and then Luke, thereby mixing up the Christologies, if you will. Why does Mark decide to make Jesus less powerful than Matthew? Like, what would make sense about a somewhat powerful Jesus then being degraded in Mark to a less powerful Jesus, and then skyrocketing with Luke up to way more powerful Jesus? And then John's kind of got a different take on everything a little bit. But just for those three right there, how do you explain that radical shift?
Yeah, absolutely. So my way of explaining it is by saying that I don't actually. I think it's somewhat imagined, if I may. And this is not an argument unique to me. To be fair. This is something that's been popularized. At least to me, it was popularized by David Wood, but other people have talked about it before. Basically, the argument is you can put the Gospels in almost any order, depending on what exactly you want to look at and say, hey, look, we see an evolving Christology here. How do you explain this? One of the best examples of that is I'm fairly certain it's either Mark or Luke that has Jesus actually doing the highest number of miracles. Whereas in John, he actually has the lowest number of miracles. And so if you wanted to go like, we have Jesus performing, he's getting more and more grandiose over time, you could actually if you wanted to go by the number of miracles he's actually performing, start with John and make your way to Mark, which is the exact opposite of what people expect, right? I think what's more likely is that Mark's not an eyewitness. The earliest church historians say that he was a pupil of Peter and that he would have known Paul. So he would be at best getting secondary sources, mainly through Peter. And they even go as far as to say that he actually wrote after Peter left Rome. So he would be writing presumably from memory, which I even think explains why there's reference that appears to be to Matthew. If he's writing from memory, perhaps he uses Matthew as a way to like guide his own memory in the same way that you might, write an autobiography about yourself and potentially read a history book that was published in wherever it is that you're from in the year 2005 to like jog your memory a little bit about exactly what happened, right? I think that's entirely possible. But nonetheless, the point just being, I think that the more likely explanation is that he doesn't have this in-depth explanation of everything per se, and appears to be almost like more detached and you could say rigid, more straightforward, the facts, that all that kind of stuff, because he's not an eyewitness. Matthew is.
Well, so if I can interrupt here to maybe refine what I'm talking about, because sure, you can pick out arbitrary things in each gospel and arrange them in different ways, right? But when I'm talking about how Jesus is the power level, if you will, of Jesus, like for instance, we have Matthew 13:58, which, but I do believe it. I had to look this up really quick. So if these are different instances, that's my bad. I know that there's one where it's the same instance of Jesus going to one town that appears in both Matthew and Mark, but we have Matthew 13:58. He says, and he did not do any miracles there because of their lack of faith. But, and then using your idea of Matthew being written first, and then you have Mark, you've got in Mark 6:5, he says he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. So so I don't understand why going between like with Matthew first and then Mark. Why would Mark like dumb down Jesus basically? Because in Matthew it has Jesus choosing not to do any miracles there because these people didn't have faith. But in Mark, he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people, I guess, that had faith. But it doesn't explicitly say that they had faith, and that's why he could do it. But do you understand how the difference in it in choosing not to do miracles and not being able to do miracles? Because it's like it's not like I'm sitting here not choosing, to fly, like Superman. I'm not, it's not like I'm making an active choice not to do that. I can't do that versus me in an alternate reality where I can fly. Me choosing not to fly is completely different.
Yeah, that's certainly a great question. I think that it also could be something though that really could be a lot of, frankly, much ado about nothing. I'll give a perfect example of it too. So like I do Bible studies constantly, right? And of course studies all the time. And I'm sure you do too, right? Obviously we're doing this kind of work. We want to make sure we actually study stuff. I personally am an incredibly detailed note taker. Like to the point of where I like fill entire 120-page notebooks up with like one book of the Bible kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's almost the entire book in there. But if you were to go through it and read it, I don't word things in the exact same way. It is redacted in a way. It is shorter, right? And you're going to see me, for example, say things like, if they say, Moses was prevented to go the way of the Philistines because, or the up north because of the Philistines, right? I just write, okay, and Israel could not go north, Philistines, something along those lines, right? Or because Philistines, right? Now, the actual book went on the full explanation of, of actually telling us what is preventing them in particular, and that, there's a level of choice involved, and that they're actually saying, well, if we go that way, it might make everybody dispirited and all that other kind of stuff. But if you look at what I wrote, I just got to the gist of it. They didn't go, and I wrote, and I communicate that by saying they couldn't go, right? I think, again, that's something it's perfectly reasonable. And by the way, I wasn't preparing to make that argument beforehand, just to be clear, right? I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to look through my notes and then, you know what I mean? I just think it's something that it's quite common, especially if you're a redactor, which I think that Mark would be, considering he's much shorter.
Well, yes, but I mean, you still have to admit that choosing not to do something is vastly different than not being able to do it. So, like, if you're sitting there redacting something, or you're taking notes on a book or somebody's personal experience, it would be an error and a misrepresentation for you to be like, oh, he couldn't do anything, when he really told you that he could do something. He just chose not to. So, I mean, these are two very different things that are not just easily speculated away, like I feel like you're trying to do here, because all this amounts to is just speculation about what could have happened without any real evidence to suggest that to suggest why Mark would dumb down Jesus in his gospel.
Well, on the flip side of that same point, though, why would Mark, if he has a dumbed down version or a more, shall we say, human version, to be, I guess, politically correct, why would Mark, in a shorter amount of time, include a greater number of miracles than Matthew or Luke or John, even, for that matter, which John, again, providing us the least number of miracles. It's actually only like 5 or 6 that he actually works, if you don't include the resurrection. It might be, I guess it might be a little bit higher than that. That might be a little bit too low, but it's not much is the point. It's a very small number.
Well, so I feel like focusing on the number of miracles is a bit arbitrary, and I don't see how that really adds to his power or adds to the Christology. It's not like in one book he can it's not like in one book he can't do a certain miracle, but in another book he can do a certain miracle. For one thing, one difference that I would focus on in this particular respect would be the effects of these miracles, or the claimed effects of the miracles in the different gospels. Because, like in John, you very clearly have a message, especially through the Lazarus story, that a resurrection, like a miracle of that, miracles in general, are enough to convince people of Jesus's divinity. But and I don't know if I'm mixing these up, but I believe Luke is very staunchly, and in fact I know that I'm right because this is also the Lazarus parable in Luke. But Luke has Jesus staunchly teaching that even if I resurrect somebody from the dead, it would not convince people that I am the divine, or that I am sent by God, or whatever in the world like that. That is the kind of difference that I would focus on. I wouldn't focus on the number of miracles. I don't see what value that really provides other than arbitrarily sorting the Bibles. I feel like looking at the deep philosophical and theological implications of these two principles is actually more important.
Well, would you agree at least that having a greater number of miracles it seems to imply a more what's the word there, prolific miracle worker, right? Like, in other words, if you have a gentleman who is going and he's feeding 5,000 twice, and also he resurrects, and also he heals somebody's eyes, and also raises somebody from the dead, and also, right? Versus somebody who just turns water into wine once and then resurrects. And I know, obviously, I didn't have an exhaustive list for either of those, right? But it does at least appear on the surface that the first one, due to the prolificness of what he's doing, right, he appears to be a greater miracle worker. Like, in other words, why is something like turning water into wine, which is a unique Johannine miracle, right? why would that in and of itself and the other small miracles like that not be considered lesser than, and I don't mean lesser in the sense that they're any worse, but lesser in the sense that like they don't appear as prolific and as strong than things that we'll have like in Mark and Luke, such as healings and resurrections, not only of himself, but of others, and happening frequently over time, turning bread into, 5,000 different pieces and stuff like that. Like that does seem on the surface to be greater.
Well, you also have to I feel like what we're missing here is the purpose of the miracles in the Gospels. The purpose of the miracles in the Gospels is to verify that Jesus is connected to, the Old Testament. Like that's the entire reason for all the miracles, because all the miracles that he does are the same miracles that the previous prophets did. If Jesus is to be the ultimate prophet, then he has to do like the same types of miracles, not the same number necessarily, but same types of miracles that the previous prophets did. And, Jesus matches all of that. So I guess I still don't see the value in comparing, well, this gospel had this many miracles, that gospel had that many miracles. Like I still don't see the value in that. I don't see the value in trying to tear out how magical like one of them are, like if one's more magical than another. I guess I just don't see the point, in actually making those determinations, because regardless of how you put it, how you spin it, Jesus is still a miracle worker. It doesn't matter if he did 50 miracles or 5 miracles, he still did them.
I guess my only thing is it appears he's a more powerful miracle worker and a more prolific miracle worker in works that are supposed to have him be a lesser character according to the mainstream narrative.
Like,
and that seems to
well, I mean, I would say that about Mark, because apparently Jesus can't do miracles in certain respects. Like he's limited on his abilities. But as you progress through the mainstream chronology of how the Gospels were written, you see Jesus getting more powerful, becoming a more powerful person. And I don't think that the number of miracles necessarily translates to how powerful of a miracle worker he was.
Well, what about quality as well, though? Because we also did bring, it's not just the number itself, but it is quality, right? Like the feeding of the 5,000, which happens twice in Mark. Mm-hmm. That's pretty, that is an impressive thing. Like if me and you saw that, it'd be like, dude, that's incredible. Like, how do you explain this? We'd be talking about it for the next 6 months on our respective channels. Like, I don't know what I saw, but some dude took 5 pieces of bread and fed 5,000 people somehow. And we got to figure that out, right? Whereas if some guy like turned water into wine, you might not even believe him. You know what I mean? You might be like, this is like Chris Angel stuff, Well, yeah, but I mean, it's still a transformation of food. Like with the water to wine thing, that's a transformation of food. Just like the in Mark, like you said, you got those 2 instances, which are, at least in my view, it's actually one instance that's just doubly put into Mark. But ultimately, this type of miracle, the transformation of food, traces back to the Old Testament. I mean, that's why Jesus had to turn the however many loaves of bread and fish. That's why he did that in that particular miracle, is because he has to fulfill like the transformation of food from Elisha and Elijah in the Kings. So I mean, these are all things that are easily traced back to and connected to what happened in the Old Testament, meaning that it's far more likely that the authors just made those instances up, which that's a little bit different than what we're talking about. You were talking about the quality of them. I mean, I still think that both of them are magical instances, and it's hard for me to really gauge how magical of an instance it was. Like, is there a lot more food that was generated rather than just a whole bunch of wine? Sure. But if you think about what it takes to authentically transform water to wine and, generate all those fish, I don't see how you can really quantify how magical something is.